Okay, so today we're looking at operating systems, and on here you can see a number of operating systems. Probably the one you use most of the time is probably Windows 11. You might have an Android phone, you might use Apple on, say, an iPhone or an iTablet. You may even use Chrome OS on a modern Chromebook computer. Okay, probably the one you haven't come across in the past is Linux, but we're going to be talking about how Linux is a very important operating system and how you actually inadvertently use it day after day. So let's first of all look at what an operating system is. So an operating system is a bridge between hardware and applications. You need to really go back a little bit in time and look at how operating systems first developed. They were created by a company called IBM so that they could sell hardware to people then who could buy software from other users. So if you think of this as being sort of on its side, this diagram, you've got one side which is hardware, one side which is software and applications which can be written by anyone. And in the middle, you've got an operating system, which is basically a translator, which translates the instructions of the user via the applications to the actual hardware. And each computer can be manufactured by different companies and have slight changes in the way they work. So the operating system has to be able to understand how to interact with each individual piece of hardware on a very fundamentally, very basic, level. A little bit more detail. The operating itself, the key part of the operating system is the part which you never actually work with yourself, which is called the kernel. The kernel is a very small sort of part of the operating system, which really is a key element of, interacting with the actual hardware. And the hardware we've discussed in the other video on hardware is particularly the CPU, which does all the control and the arithmetic logic units and so on, the memory, and other devices as well, such as things, for example, like sound cards. So if you're playing a game or you're doing something which requires sound, to be able to make sounds, it has to interact with things like sound cards, it has to interact with graphics cards, and so on and so on. And that's what the job of the kernel is. The kernel itself is constantly interacting and translating the requirements of the user via the application downwards. Now, operating systems themselves also have something called applications. These are the programs which run as part of the operating system. The programs such as control panel and running file management and all these sort of things which you do day to day with the operating system, which come with the operating system such as Windows and the Apple operating system. So these are the applications we're talking about here. We're not talking about applications like Office and photo editing software and such like. But above that, you do then have user applications, and then you have the user themselves. You are the user, of course, and that's why it's an important part of the process. So from the user downwards, the user clicks a button on the keyboard, on the mouse or the key, presses the key on the keyboard, which then starts off a process. So, for example, using the analogy of clicking the print button on the application, that then has to be translated and then told to the actual hardware what to do. And that's the job of the operating system. So via the operating system, the kernel then translates that into instructions and then passes that through to the CPU. And that's the whole point of the operating system. Now, operating systems do a little bit more. They also deal with things like, for example, error handling. So if you remember, in the past, you may have had what's often referred to as a blue screen of death. More common these days is to get a box pop up on your computer telling you an application stopped working or frozen, and it simply just clears the program itself. Operating systems also deal with programs generally. So when you run programs and what have you, you're running them within an operating system, and programs themselves have to be written for the operating system. Operating systems have also over the years become very good at dealing with memory and managing the memory, so that no matter how much memory you have, it uses the memory most efficiently. It also deals with the obviously interactions with the user, so the actual mouse itself, the way the mouse moves, the speed the mouse operates at, what happens when you do a single click, what happens when you do double clicks. All these things are controlled by the operating systems. The processor management, again, dealing with how the processor works, what it does it go to sleep if it's not used for more than 5 minutes, all these sort of things are controlled by the operating systems. And, dealing with general things like security and managing files, all again are dealt with the operating system. Even though you might think the operating system is only a part of your computer's interface, it is the main core of computers themselves. So let's very quickly look at some operating systems. So there's some of the operating system logos you might be familiar with. Now, most operating systems you use on desktops and laptops. So we're talking about obviously Windows. We're talking about the Apple Mac, Chrome OS, which is often referred to as a Chromebook. You may not have used Linux on a desktop or a laptop before, but it's very much a well-known operating system for this sort of application. Likewise, with mobile devices, there's actually certain operating systems which are designed especially for mobile phones. So the classic there will be Android, which is the most commonly used mobile phone operating system. When I mean mobile, I mean, both phones and tablets as well. And likewise with Apple. Now, the area which you probably don't have much experience of is server, and this is where Linux comes into its own. And we're going to look at the history of Linux and where it came from in a minute. But for now, just think of all those things you do on the internet. A lot, if not all of those things, are actually done by computers on the internet running Linux. So this is where Linux very much comes into its own sort of area of expertise. So there's a quick summary of the various operating systems. So for Windows, very much you find on desktops and laptops, used by home, used in offices, already tends to become pre-installed on the computer, which makes it much easier to actually set up. Likewise with Apple software only runs officially on Apple devices, so you have to purchase Apple devices. Apple software has a reputation for being more secure than Windows, and it's quite an established brand. And again, you can find it on both mobile and desktop. Now, Linux is the one which nobody seems to know much about, but without Linux, we really wouldn't be in the position we are now when it comes to computing technology. So Linux, it's extremely secure. It's based on an older operating system called Unix. We'll look at in just a minute. You need to pretty well install it yourself. You don't have many brands of computers which come with a version of Linux pre-installed. The main reason is the Linux community have a whole variety of different distributions of Linux, and very few people agree on which version or distribution they prefer. So installing Linux is very much a case of choosing which version of Linux you like, which flavor, if you wish, and installing it for yourself, which for the more technical user is not a major issue to install an operating system for themselves. And of course, we've got Android, which is also an offshoot and shares very common heritage to Linux itself. It's basically a version of Linux on the mobile phone, and it's affordable because it's actually free. Google give it away for free. They bought the company, the original Android company, and they give it away for free. And it's based on Unix, which makes it very secure as well. And then the odd one out, if you wish, also a Google product is Chrome OS, and very often you'll hear the term Chromebook. So a computer which is basically running Chrome OS is referred to as a Chromebook. Found quite a lot in education, very popular in education altogether, and generally comes auto installed, but you can download Chrome OS yourself, what's called Chrome OS Flex, and install it. And it's particularly useful to install it on an older computer, maybe a computer you thought was coming to the end of its life and not really fast enough anymore. Chrome OS will actually give it a new speed, new sort of energy. It's quite a good operating system for that. So let's have a look at the history of operating systems. Okay, so let's start off by looking at Windows. Windows being the main operating system people know about, and a bit of a history to Windows, which you may not be familiar with. So if we zoom into the Windows area here, now Microsoft actually started life basically as a subcontractor for a larger computer company called IBM. You may or may not have heard of. IBM made very large computers for really big companies. So obviously, sort of like banks, governments, organizations such as that would have a computer built by IBM, and the software on that computer will be written by IBM, especially for that one particular computer, for that one application. Now, that was obviously quite a good business model for IBM, but they realized that there was a large number of smaller companies who really could benefit from computers. But IBM didn't want to get involved with creating software for those companies. They wanted to keep their computer systems streamlined, just concentrating on the hardware. So they realized they needed this middleman, this extra piece of software which needed to be written so that it could open up the actual market for users to develop their own software or to employ other people to write software or even buy software. Although that wasn't originally envisaged, but you can as you know, you can buy software, and because so many people are using the same software, it's cheaper. Whereas originally, to be able to afford a computer and your own software was very, very expensive indeed. And that very much opened the computer industry to what eventually became home users and what we have today. So anyway, IBM were in the market for somebody to write an operating system, and somehow they heard of a young enterprising person called Bill Gates, and we all know Bill Gates from Microsoft. And they paid Bill Gates to go and create an operating system for their newly released computer called the PC, personal computer. So Bill Gates goes away, uses the basis of an existing operating system he knew of called CPM, Control Program Monitor, and brought the ideas from CPM into a new operating system, which initially was called PC-DOS for the IBM PC, but later on Microsoft started selling under their own name as MS-DOS, Microsoft DOS. Now, MS-DOS is a text-based operating system. It's not an easy operating system to use. You'd have to have some sort of training in it. You'd have to issue commands by typing in on the keyboard. And if you type things wrongly, the commands wouldn't execute and so on. So, it wasn't the easiest operating system in the world. But eventually, IBM came back and asked Microsoft to create a second operating system, which for their own computers was referred to as OS2, Operating System 2. So IBM brought in 1987 OS2, which was well thought of, but it took about 7 years before Microsoft came up with their own version, which they then sold. And because they sold it to any computing company, it very much opened up, and it was the start of the modern computer industry as we know it today. So Windows 3 was the first commercially available version of Windows. Versions 1 and 2 obviously weren't quite right and they weren't usable. So version 3 was the first working version which was sold. And over the years, we've had a number of variations from 95, from Windows 7, Windows 8, etc. And as you can see, although it shows currently Windows 10, we're on Windows 11 at the moment, and Windows 12 will be released later on this year with plans for Windows 13 and even a Windows 14 in the near future. Okay. Now, before all this ever happened, probably before, computers were being thought of as a small device used by individuals or even small companies, computers were only used by large organizations. And there was an operating system which in itself also came from a previous operating system called Multics. But this one particular operating system was very much a key to modern computing, an operating system called Unix. Now, this operating system was quite expensive. This was the operating system which later would run on the large computers companies like IBM built for large organizations. And it was designed as a way of sharing programs amongst operating systems and different users, again, making it more accessible for users. So operating systems such as Unix are still, even to this day, used by large organizations and even governments. Now, Unix, although it's when you go to university to learn things like computer science and what have you, you don't concentrate so much on the Windows environment. You very much concentrate on the business software, and that is based on Unix. So Unix is a key operating system, and there's been various offshoots of Unix over the years. So, for example, Berkeley University created their own version of Unix, which is called BSD. And that's an important operating system for later on when we look at the Apple Mac, because that was the operating system Apple later used. Likewise, there's another variant of Unix, which via the work of one educator, one professor in America, who was creating his own version of Unix called Minix. But one of his own students was inspired by Minix, even though he wasn't able to get access to Minix. It wasn't available because it wasn't finished, and the professor wasn't happy to share until it was finished. One particular student called Lennox Travald basically created his own version of Unix based on what he had seen in Minix and in Unix itself while he was at university. And he created this version of Linux. He actually created what we call the kernel. Think back of what we've talked about when we looked at hardware. The operating system itself is based into two main categories: the applications which come with the operating system, which are the things which control your mouse and make things look pretty, give you a start menu, give you menus and choices. But also below that, which you never see as a user, is what's called the kernel, the thing that, which interacts with the actual hardware and can control different types of hardware to perform similar tasks. Well, Linux Reval created the kernel, which allowed others to then build upon that applications within the operating system to work with different hardware. And unlike his predecessors, he was happy to share, even though his work wasn't completely finished. His kernel was buggy and had a few sort of issues. He openly shared Linux with anyone who would happily, improve it, would work with him, and very much over the years has developed a community of programmers and journal writers and people who are helping out in many ways to create an alternative operating system, which very much is a credit to helping and cooperative sort of programmers. And with many things in computers, Linux became an offshoot in itself. It became a number of variations. We have, for example, just a few of them here, such as Slackware, Debian, Red Hat, Gentoo, and Arch Linux. And each of them in themselves concentrate on different aspects and work in different ways, have different looks and feels. Some look more like the Apple operating system. Some look very similar to Windows indeed. Some look completely unique and different in any way to any other operating system. But in regards to the different variations, what we call distributions of Linux, each one concentrated on a different aspect and had different advantages, disadvantages. And later on, each one, again, in its own way, will become used as a basis for other operating systems, other variations, other distributions. And we'd end up with operating systems based on other operating systems, such as we see here. Chrome OS is actually based on Gentoo Linux, which is an offshoot in itself of Linux, which is, of course, an offshoot of Unix. So you can see there's this multi-factor generation of operating systems based on previous operating systems. And the Unix community itself has very much expanded. One of the areas which, of course, we don't realize or appreciate is Linux has created some very important operating systems. So, for example, when I look over here, we've got Android. Android, in its sense, is basically Linux designed from the very start to run on a mobile phone sized device. And even Android has created its own offshoots in the form of Fire OS, which you'll find is the basis of the Fire Stick, which is created by Amazon. So there are many variations, some of which you won't appreciate the importance, such as Chrome OS, which is a really, important operating system when it comes to cheap computing in the form of Chromebooks for education and what have you. Now, let's go and have a look at Apple, because, of course, the one other camp which people know about as well as Windows and as well as possibly Linux and the various communities out there using Linux, is Apple. Now, Apple also had a bit of a story when they started. They started off with the two Steves. We had two Steve Jobs, which everyone knew, which was a marketing genius who was able to sell computers and became very popular. And we also have Steve Wozniak, who's a very shy and retiring person, who was a electronics genius who could make computers out of basically scrap parts. And Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, very much in the early 80s, started developing their own computers, making their own components and what have you out of parts, they brought together themselves. And they heard about a device which was being pioneered at Park Alto Labs, which was run by Xerox. Xerox being the old photocopier company you may or may not remember from the very early 50s onwards, basically a well-known company in its day. And they were trying to develop what we would now call a tracker ball, which was like basically a mouse upside down with a big ball, and you'd move the ball, and that would move some sort of icon or character on the screen. And the story goes, one day somebody knocked this tracker ball over, and as they moved this to pick it up, they realised it also moved the ball, which also then moved the character on the actual screen, and that's how they accidentally created the mouse. So Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak went to look at this, what later became known as the mouse, and it was called a mouse because it was a box with a wire sticking out, almost looked like a tail coming out of a mouse. And they thought it was brilliant, it was genius, and they licensed that concept to put in their very first operating system, which Steve Jobs named after his daughter Lisa. So we had the very first ever graphical operating system called Apple Lisa. Now that only lasted very short period of time, a year or two, when they brought out a much more affordable, much more usable version of their operating system, which they called the Mac OS. Now the Mac OS was around and was being developed by Apple for many years, and it was a lot of work. It was hard work, and for many years they were developing this operating system. But eventually, a new member of staff came to work for them, one of many members of staff who'd already experienced developing operating systems and increasing operating systems from Berkeley University, and he was a user of Berkeley SD. Berkeley SD was BSD was an offshoot of Unix itself. So it's not directly related to Linux as such, but it's directly related to Linux predecessor Unix. And Berkeley was basically a hotbed of people developing and improving its own operating system. Needless to say, this this engineer had actually got a job at Apple. He'd had previous experience of offshoots of Berkeley, such as Darwin OS, and presented the idea of using Darwin OS as the basis of a new version to be improved over time of Mac OS, which they did in 2001. So after 2001, everything was transported into the new version, the Unix version of the Mac OS operating system, which even to this day it still does, both for mobile phone and mobile devices as well as for desktops. So we have, at the end of this process, we have all but Windows now run as part of the Unix family. So it's very much like a disjointed family if you think of a family with cousins, and there's very much a very complicated web of, interrelated variations. So from Unix itself, you got Unix, which spawned a number of other Unixes, BSD, System 5. They in themselves spawned variations of themselves in different ways, and over time they were recycled and reused in such ways which surprisingly create some very important operating systems. The most important ones of which, of course, will be the Apple operating system, which is used and beloved by many users. The the environmental Linux operating system, which has been splintered into numerous hundreds, if not thousands, of variations, including Chrome OS, which is used on Chromebooks, and Android, which is used on mobile phones. And of course, we still have in development the Microsoft pathway, which is even to this day being developed with version 12 to come soon, and so on. But we still only have two major routes for Linux and Windows, being the major families of operating systems. And my question is this: which operating system do you use most? Well, most people always assume Windows because, of course, you probably use Windows when you think of computing. But in reality, very few people only use Windows. All of us have mobile phones, and the mobile phones tend to be dominated by either the Apple or, in most cases, about 70 to 80%, I understand, use Android as the basis of their operating system on mobile phone and tablets as well. So very much Unix is very much in that area. But the other reason people don't realize they're using Unix so much is the internet itself is very much dominated by Unix. Even though Windows was based initially on the work of CP/M, and CP/M, even in its own logo, uses a forward slash. Windows decided to use a backslash when they actually use file structures. So let me give you an example of how you know which operating system you're understandably, you're absolutely using at the time. Here's a folder structure. If I click on up here, when I'm on Windows, as all Windows systems do, I'm using backslash to represent the difference between one folder and another folder. And we start off with the name of a drive with a colon, then a backslash, then the subfolder, and then a backslash, then the name of the next subfolder, and so on. The structure for Windows using backslash is common since the very beginning, since DOS, since PC-DOS, since MS-DOS. And Windows has always used backslash. But when you're on the internet, have you ever noticed that in reality, on the internet, you're actually using a forward slash? So if I go to a website, so I'll go, for example, to Google Classroom. When I go to Google Classroom, you'll see I'm using forward slash. I'm not using forward slash. That's what the internet uses because the internet is based on Unix systems. And even Microsoft themselves have to use forward slashes because that's the original architecture of the internet. And the vast majority of all computers connected in the form of servers on the internet are Unix based and particularly Linux based. The reason they're particularly Linux based is very much to do with the fact that they still use the operating system which was freely developed and given away by Linux Travailed. And the reason they use that is simply cost. Because Linux is based on the original Unix operating system, it's also very secure, it's very fast, it's very simple to use, and it's consistent. So users on internet websites and servers still to this day prefer Linux as their main basis, and they could be using one of many distributions of Linux. But at the end of the day, all these variants of Linux also have server versions of Linux, which are freely and openly available. Anybody can use them, put them onto a computer connected to the internet and act as a server. And they perform the internet tasks, which we use very, most frequently. So all the major internet providers and services you use, for example, Facebook, Amazon, eBay, all these companies use Linux as their back end. So while you're actually using your computer, unless you're physically on a desktop computer with Windows using desktop applications, the chances are you're probably using some sort of Unix-based application running on the internet somewhere, or you're probably using an internet-based device such as a smartphone or tablet, and that device is most likely, if not always, going to be using Unix. There's very few Windows-based mobile devices available for sale within the UK or anywhere these days. So my question area earlier would have been, how often do you use, which operating system do you use most often? Most people assume Windows, but amazingly, statistics show that the vast majority of what you're using is based on Unix.